Guitar nerds, what's up? It's Pete Thorn. Welcome to the studio, and hey, welcome to a very special Amps in the Zone video. I've got a great job. I know it. It's not lost on me, and this week was no exception. How cool is this? I got to check out an extraordinarily cool guitar amplifier with an amazing history, great story attached to this amplifier. It's a 1973 Marshall Super Lead amplifier, 100 watts. That was modded by the legendary Jose Arredondo right here in the San Fernando Valley, was owned by Mick Mars of Motley Crue, and used on many, many classic Motley Crue recordings, maybe most notably the Dr. Feelgood album. Now, in 2003, Mick actually decided to sell some of his gear. Richard Fortus from the band Guns N' Roses literally went over to his house and picked it up, bought it right from him, and he plugged into a whole bunch of different amplifiers that day, and he said this amp just jumped out at him as being like unlike any Marshall that he'd ever heard, even other Marshalls that were modded by Jose. Richard subsequently ended up using the amp on many studio recordings as well. So fast forward all the way to 2021, Richard's actually decided to sell the amplifier as a part of a big gear sale that he's doing through Chicago Music Exchange right now as I'm making this video. So the amplifier is actually sold, but it came to Dave Friedman's shop so that Dave could give it the once over. It needed a retube real bad, so it's got fresh power tubes in it, and that's why I was actually able to check it out here in my studio. Hey, I'm burning the tubes in, getting it ready to send off to the new owner. So let's turn some knobs. I'll play through the amp a little bit. Right now, I've got it mic'd up through my old 70s Marshall cabinet out in the other room. It's mic'd up with a 57 and a 421 blended pretty much equally, and it sounds just great. Let's check it out. So I was just thinking the tone of this amp, and this is what I thought the very first time I heard it, is rude and raw and kind of brash and not compressed, really punchy and full, lots of mids. It doesn't really have anything to do with, like, say, the Eddie Van Halen guitar sound, but it's kind of funny because everybody always associates Eddie with the Jose thing. I guess he helped put Jose on the map. But folks that actually did record with Jose mods and used them, like Mick, this tone didn't really have anything to do with Eddie Van Halen, the way the amp is actually set right now. It's a completely different sound that's maybe more akin to, like, Steve Jones or something, like, you know. You know, it sounds like that song to me, which is also a great, amazing guitar sound. I mean, I remember the first time I actually heard that song, which was probably before I actually heard Eddie Van Halen, and I was just like 10 years old. I'm like, oh my God, what is this music? This music is insane, and the guitar sounded like it was ripping out of the speakers, you know? So anyways, I just hear a lot of that punk in this amp, and when I think about Mick, and, you know, he was definitely had like a healthy dose of punk rock in his guitar playing. It stands to reason that the amp set like this and the tones that it makes would really have appealed to him, that rude, raw, like just kick-ass rock and roll, brash tone that it makes. And yet it's rich, you know? It's got a richness to it. Richard, what's up? How are you?
What's going on?
I'm good. Everything good with you?
It's been actually weeks since we've spoken.
I know, right? You're my new guitar best buddy, and yeah, I miss you when we don't talk.
I know. I feel the same. The amp.
Yeah. It's sitting right there. So
okay, so what are your impressions?
So when I played it, it was like wow, this doesn't sound like other ones that I've played in that. And I haven't gone and played other ones yet to see if I set other ones that way, if they'll do a similar thing or not. But just my impression was there's a lot of Steve Jones going on, like almost there's like a just raw Marshall punk rock thing.
Yes. Yeah.
More than that sort of gainy, compressed Eddie Van Halen thing.
Exactly. And that's
You
what
know?
really attracted me is the expressiveness of it. It's
Yeah.
really responds to your touch, So it's
Yeah.
not as gainy and compressed, which all the other ones I plugged into were. And
Hmm.
that one just had like this air to it
Yeah.
that that's what I loved about it. And that's what I think is so cool about it.
Very cool. Like it's really
Yeah.
full sounding. There's this, and which is awesome. Like with the normal channel blended in, you get a little less gain when you do the pull both and you blend both channels. But then of course you've got the gain boost in front. And the way you guys, at least the markings are sort of similar for all the volumes, even the different markings.
Yeah.
The grease pencil and the black markings. And if I set the volumes which would be a little lower than I would normally set, then I would have thought, that I would set a Jose gain mod. It sounds kind of like plexi gain, but it's got this different thing.
It's got that thump and like a metal front that kicks you in the chest, right? When you
Yeah.
lay into it. And that's what, I was just like, that's
Really
it.
tight
And
too.
super tight and fast,
Yeah,
and
just
it's
mean.
got, yes, yeah. It has that thing around 2K that like it has teeth.
This is the main thing I wanted to ask you because there's markings on the front of the amp, and I'm not sure if those are your markings or if maybe they were mixed markings and we're always there, or
Both of ours.
like a black sort of arrow, and then there's other ones in kind of like white grease pencil.
Right.
And
Yeah. So that's both of our markings. So I don't know which are which, but
with the markings, the way everything was set, that you're using it with the channels linked, and maybe he was too. Which most people, I think, with the Jose's, many times maybe they wouldn't use the two channels linked in the volume 1 and volume 2 to blend in the normal channel 2. Like a lot of people just go for the more aggressive channel 1 tone.
Yeah, no, that wasn't my thing.
Yeah.
And that's a really like when I was at Mick's house, and I don't know if I told you this before, when I was plugging into a bunch of Jose modded vintage Marshalls at his house, and I plugged into that one, and it was just glorious. I mean, just hit one chord, and it was like, that's the greatest amp that I've ever heard. I mean, it was just, instant. And that was the way it was set. Yeah.
It's exciting playing through it because of the provenance, and you owned it, and then Mick owned it, of course, and used it on the record. And so it's exciting.
Yeah, I used it on so many recordings. I mean, when I bought that after I just joined Guns and we'd done a tour, and then I was looking to buy a bunch more Marshalls, and Lloyd at Voltage called me up and said, "Hey, you want to come over to Mick's house? He's selling a bunch of amps.
Yeah.
And I know you're looking for Marshalls." So that's how I got there.
It's really interesting. I remember that time. I remember being in Lloyd's. I actually remember, I think he had some of the amps in Voltage in Hollywood. I remember seeing.
He bought some. He bought a 612 cab.
Oh, wow.
That day, and a Plexi. I also bought a Plexi, a 50 watt.
Yeah.
Most of them were 2 inputs, a few 4 inputs, but all Jose's.
Okay.
But that was the only one that sounded like that. And as soon as I plugged in, I was like, "Oh yeah, well that was my amp," and that's the one I did the records with. And I was like, "Oh man, you can't. You got to keep that." And he was like, "Nah, I don't need it." He's like, "Look, if you think you're taking advantage of me, you're not. You're helping me out. I don't need it."
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So he even related the story to you. He said, "That's the one I did all the records with."
Yeah. And he said there were 2, I guess, that he used and he did the tours with.
Wow.
And Rudy Laren, I don't know if you know Rudy Laren.
Yeah, Eddie's
legendary tech, right? Anyways, he's the one that cut those holes in that.
Really?
The fans. Yeah, intake and outtake fans.
That's amazing. Okay, great. Now I got a little backstory to that. That's incredible. Because yeah, this is great. I mean,
Oh yeah, it's
the
classic.
tape.
And I never touched it. That's the
Wow.
way it came to me.
So Rudy was teching for Mick then in '89.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, that's really interesting. I'm learning a lot.
Yeah,
Well, it sounds fantastic, and I think it's. Yeah, I'm happy that you were okay with us making a video of it before it left here. I figure I'm just burning the tubes in anyway, making sure it's good before it leaves the shop.
exactly.
Goes to the new owner and everything. But it's great to preserve this stuff historically.
Yeah. I'm really anxious to hear. It's been cloned. I've had it cloned a few times
Right.
by different people that have gone through it. And, Trace at Voodoo,
Yeah.
he did a great job with it.
Okay.
And those are the amps that I use live now. And we've been tweaking on those over the years. So it's sort of become a little bit of a different thing. But I'm really anxious to hear what Dave does.
I heard it actually. Like what he was trying to, he had a kind of amp that he chose to as kind of a donor, prototype, and he went through and actually I heard it on an amp switcher going back and forth, and it's pretty much indistinguishable.
That's what I love about Dave. I mean, I knew he'd be because he's the master of that.
I know, man. It's great to see you. I know you got to go because you've got a lot going on. So thanks for being here. Hang out for 1 second. I'll just I'll say bye to you, but I'm going to end our little recording here.
Right on.
Okay, so now I'm just going to play through the amp a little bit, and I'm going to talk about the controls, talk about the mods, and demonstrate what everything does, and hopefully give you a good idea of how Jose's mods make this amp differ from a stock 1973 Super Lead like it would have started life as. So maybe you saw the video that I did on the Steve Vai modded Marshall that was modded by Jose about a year ago. I think I put out that video. That amp actually had a couple more modifications in it, even beyond what this one has. So Steve's amp had a master volume that you could switch from pre-EQ to post-EQ, before the tone stack or after the EQ tone stack. The pre-EQ master sounded a little bit more like, almost like the loudness button on a stereo. Big bottom end, big top end. And it worked really well at low volumes. But when you turn the amplifier up, the post EQ master, which is what this amp actually has in it and what Steve's amp also had, just the differences in Steve's, you could switch between them. The post EQ master sounds a little more open and a little bit more like the kind of raw sort of stock Marshall character. So I think that this master actually is my favorite, and it sort of preserves the tone of the amp better, if that makes sense. So Steve's amps also had some Zener limiting built in that you could switch on and off. That was another thing that Jose did that would kind of give the amp more of a saturated, once again, a little bit more metal sound to it. This amp doesn't have that mod. So this is more of the stock kind of Jose mods, which is basically post EQ master volume and a gain boost in front of the standard Marshall Super Lead circuit. Okay, so in other words, a tube gain stage that he would add in front of the stock Marshall preamp. So because the amp has a built-in master volume, kind of when you run the volume a little bit lower, you're not driving the amplifier as hard, obviously. So even though you can get pretty much straight up stock plexi sounds out of the amplifier, or Super Lead sounds out of the amplifier, you might find that they're a little lower gain than like a totally stock Marshall. Because when you add that master volume in, generally speaking, you're going to generally turn it down a little bit, and then you're not going to get as much drive into the power amp, also into the phase inverter, because this is a pre-phase inverter master volume. So right now, plugged into the top left input, let's just forget about the added gain stage in the amp, because when I plug into the top left input, that gain stage isn't turned on. So basically what I've got right now is a straight up Marshall Super Lead amp with an added master volume, and it sounds like this right now. Okay, really good sounding, nice rich tone, right? I'm plugged into, the top left input, and right now I've got the volume 1 on 8 on the amp. Now, normally a stock Super Lead would be making more gain than that on 8, but because the master's turned down a little bit, I'm not getting quite as much. If I brought up the master, Okay, so you can hear the amp grinds more and gets more distorted and big sounding as I turn up that master volume. I'm already pushing pretty hard right now, even with that master turned down. But that was the thing about the Jose's. He gave you a master, you could turn the amp down, you'd get a little bit less gain out of the amp stock, but then with the added gain boost in front, it's going to bring the gain up. Okay, so in order to get the added gain boost to come on, I actually have to plug into this bottom left input here, and then this pot right here needs to be pulled out. This is actually the volume for the gain boost. Okay, so basically nothing happens if that's pushed in, but if I pull it out, now I've got signal and I've got the gain boost in front of the standard Marshall super lead preamp with the volume on 8. Okay, and keep in mind the channel 2, the normal channel, is not in the equation right now. I'm not using it right now. Okay, so it's just volume 1 with the gain boost in front. And this pot will allow me to vary the level going into it. So I'll put the pot for the gain boost on about 5 or, let's put it on about 6 right now, or about 2 o'clock. We'll listen to the tone. Okay, great tone. Not that much gain though, right? Sounds kind of like plexi, loud, but this is actually at a lower volume. This would be like more like a club volume actually that I've got the amp at right now. So this would work great set like this for, you know, somebody that wanted just a good rock and Marshall tone that maybe you would boost with like a tube screamer or something. Really cool sound set like that. Now, if you want to get more gain, you just keep turning up that gain boost, this added pot right here. So I'll bring it all the way up almost on 10. Lots of tight gain there, but it's not like a super high gain like modern sound or anything like that, is it? You know, it's just kind of like a great searing rock and roll tone. That is really the Jose sound, basically. That is the sound that I would say that most bands that bought these amps and used them in the 80s, most guitar players, you know, probably were going for. Okay, so I've got the volume on the amp, the volume 1 on about 8. And listen what happens actually if I turn it all the way up to 10, and then I'm going to slowly sort of reduce it. You hear the sound just thin out a little bit, and like when I had it on 10 it was a little bit bloated, and then it thins out a little bit as I bring the volume down, but it also gets tighter. That's the bright cap coming into play on that volume 1, and just allows the amp to, I don't know, it just tightens up a little bit. It's almost like too much when it's on 10. Yes, you'll get more distortion, but it can get a little bit loose. It's a great sound, but it's just a little looser. So it sounds really cool when you back it down, and, you know, interestingly enough, these are the settings marked on the amp, but you back it down to about 3/4 of the way up. The amp just tightens up a little bit, and it sounds really cool. Okay, now check this out. We haven't even brought in volume 2 into the equation here at all. And in order to get the second channel of the amp, the sort of the normal channel on the Marshall to come on, what you need to do is pull out the volume 2 pot, just like that. Now, if you were listening closely, you might have heard the gain drop a little bit. You heard the hiss drop a little bit. Listen close. Okay, so what happens is, this is just like jumpering the 2 inputs on an old school Marshall. So if you plug into the top left input and then use a jumper cable to go from the bottom left to the top right, what happens is now you can get both volumes active, but you always lose a little bit of gain. And that's fine if you're playing like Allman Brothers tones or maybe Bad Company or stuff like that. It can work just fine. But in the context of like hard rock or metal sound, that was never something that people would want, I don't think, generally speaking. So what happens though is you lose a little bit of gain, but when you turn on the extra gain boost, you can of course make it up with the tone in front. So with the settings marked on the amplifier, that, you know, there's a couple different sets of settings on here. Supposedly one of them were mixed settings, and then some of them are Richard settings, but they're really pretty similar. They're not that far off. So if I set the amp up to the settings that are on the front panel, just going to do that really quick. I think that's pretty close. This is the way that the amp, I think, was mainly used by maybe both those guys. So you can hear that it's not really like a ton of gain or anything like that. Okay, so great for like rock and roll, but it's got a fatter tone than if I was only playing through channel 1 of the amp, like when I started out playing. So bringing in that second channel into the equation and blending it in just gives you more fullness without any more added brightness, that's for sure. It just thickens up the tone. Okay, so because you've got the tube boost in front of both channels running at the same time, the tube boost adds gain, but that tube boost actually has a whole bunch of low end leaned out of it, okay, in the circuit. So what happens is there's not a hell of a lot of bass coming out of that first tube added gain stage. And because of that, you can then mix in that normal channel and you still get a nice, full, relatively tight sound because you're boosting with a fairly tight sound going into the Marshall Super Lead preamp. And you're not getting a super gainy tone because when we drop the gain a little bit by pulling out that volume 2 there and jumpering the channels, you get that little bit of gain loss. So long story short, the tone of this amplifier is all about sort of the sum of the parts. The gain stage in front, bunch of low end leaned out of that added gain stage, then hitting the Marshall Super Lead preamp with the channels jumpered, but the gain drops a little bit when you jumper the channels. But because you don't have so much bass going into it, you can bring in channel 2 a lot, which fattens and thickens up the tone just enough, and it's like a recipe, essentially. It's no different than making like a nice pasta or something like that. It's just some of the parts is what this tone is all about. One more thing I'll just add is that on like Marshall Super Leads, you know how the EQ just doesn't seem that active. You can kind of, you know, make big adjustments without making a huge differences. On this amplifier, the second that you add a tube gain boost in front, the EQ becomes way more active. So listen to like the mids as I turn it up and down. Okay, so there's a lot of action there on the controls, so you just got to kind of find your settings and figure out what to do with the EQ. Essentially, everything on 5 is a great place to start, and then you can just kind of tweak from there. And everything that, all the settings that are marked here, you can actually see on the amp are not too far off from 5, other than the bass. Because once again, when you lean out the front end of the amplifier a ton with that tube gain stage, but it's got a lot of bass lopped off coming out of it, you kind of need to turn up the bass in the EQ. So it wouldn't sound too great to have the bass all the way down, which is a common thing that people do a lot on Marshall Super Leads, turning that bass way down. But it sounds much better on this amp if you have it up around, you know, 3/4 of the way up, essentially, and that sounds really cool. Thanks for watching my video on this classic 1973 Marshall Super Lead amplifier with such a great history, of course owned by Mick Mars, Richard FORTUS, and modded by the legendary Jose Arredondo. I hope I was able to show that these amps are actually capable of making more than just super saturated high gain tones. They can do punch you in the gut, you know, punk flavored, straight up rock and roll aggressive tones just as well. And Mick, of course, put that to legendary use on the Dr. Feelgood record. Thanks to Richard and Dave Friedman for helping me hook up doing this video. And thanks to all you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. Hit subscribe if you haven't. I'd really appreciate you coming back to my channel. Hit the little bell beside the subscribe. You'll get an alert when I put out a new video. And if you dug this one, please hit the thumbs up. It helps spread the video far and wide in the YouTube universe. I'll see you guys real soon for more Amps in the Zone and more YouTube videos in general. I am Pete Thorn. Take care.